Welcome to the History Maps podcast. In the year 1509, the ground beneath Istanbul heaved violently. They actually called it the Little Doomsday.
Yeah, which is a terrifying name.
It really is. Minarets snapped in half, heavy stone walls fractured, and thousands of people perished as the earth essentially tore itself apart along the North Anatolian Fault.
Right.
And in the aftermath of that, apocalyptic earthquake, the architects of the empire were handed what seems like an impossible mandate.
Totally impossible, yeah.
Because they needed to build these massive soaring stone structures that could command the skyline and project absolute imperial authority. But
they had to engineer them to survive the earth literally shaking them to pieces.
exactly. And, when you look at a building, it's so easy for you to just see a static object. Walls, a roof, a place to seek shelter. We expect buildings to be functional and unmoving.
Well, sure.
But if you look closer, architecture is rarely just about shelter. It is a physical record of an empire's psychology, its anxieties, its ambitions. So today, we are taking a deep dive into Ottoman architecture, which is a core component of our History of Architecture series. We're going to trace how the Ottoman Empire built its identity over centuries.
Yeah, it's a massive topic.
It is. We will follow this trajectory, starting from their nomadic Turkic roots in the 14th century, peaking with the geometrically perfected domes that define their classical era, and eventually shifting into a deliberate cosmopolitan globalism where they blended their own traditions with European Baroque and Neoclassical styles.
Right, and the scope of this architectural evolution is vast. But what becomes immediately clear when you study the source material is that Ottoman architecture is not a monolith.
Not at all.
It is a continuous, highly dynamic absorption of Byzantine, Seljuk, Persian, and eventually Western European influences. But and this is key, those influences were not really copied.
They were adapting them.
Meticulously adapted and synthesized.
Right.
And it was all to serve very specific purposes, like Islamic court protocol, communal welfare, and the explicit projection of dynastic power.
Yeah.
Every stone placed, every tile fired in a kiln, every courtyard designed. It was a calculated decision driven by the political and environmental realities of that specific time.
So let's start with those environmental and political realities. We're talking the 14th and 15th centuries. The Ottomans are establishing their presence in Anatolia. They're in the middle of this profound transition from a nomadic lifestyle on the steppes to a settled imperial one.
A huge cultural shift.
Huge. And I want to suggest a way for you to picture this early period. Think of the early Ottoman structures as the petrification of the nomadic yurt.
I like that analogy.
Because when you consider a traditional Turkic yurt, it's a circular, highly flexible structure. It uses a wooden lattice frame covered in felt, right?
Right, with the central compression ring at the top.
Yeah, and it provides this large, open interior space that's supported entirely by tension and the exterior frame. There are no heavy, space-consuming interior walls blocking your view. So how does that flexible, lightweight, adaptable interior actually translate into permanent heavy stone mosques in early Anatolia?
Well, that transition from a lightweight tensile structure to, heavy masonry, that's the fundamental engineering puzzle of the early Ottoman period.
It's a completely different physics.
Completely different. And the shift from wood and felt to stone, it was driven by pure necessity. I mean, Anatolia has abundant limestone quarries, which gave them the raw material. But more importantly, the region was politically unstable.
Right. Rival Belix.
Yeah, rival groups, constant skirmishes, and the ever-present threat of fire in these densely packed timber settlements.
Fire was a massive issue.
Oh, devastating. So they needed permanence, they needed security, and fire resistance. But culturally, like you said, they still carried that memory of the yurt.
They wanted the space.
Right. The desire for expansive, unbroken communal spaces where the entire community could gather at once. But the problem they faced was one of structural mechanics. When you build a roof out of stone, you're dealing with immense weight and a force called thrust.
Thrust meaning the energy pushing outward.
Exactly. If you want a wide open space, you can't simply lay flat stones across a wide gap.
Because they'll just snap.
Right, they will crack and collapse under their own weight. So you have to use arches and domes to distribute that compression downward.
But if they wanted a massive open space to replicate that communal gathering area from the yurt, why not just build one giant dome over a massive scroll room right from the start?
Well, because they didn't yet possess the engineering vocabulary to contain the outward thrust of a single massive dome.
Oh, okay.
Because a dome exerts downward force due to gravity, obviously, but it also exerts lateral force. It actively wants to push the walls outward.
Like a wedge being driven down.
Exactly like a wedge. So if you put a heavy stone dome on 4 straight walls without proper support, the walls will just bow out and the whole roof caves in.
Yikes.
Yeah. So early Ottoman architects utilized a different strategy, which is the multi-dome hypostyle approach.
Hypostyle meaning a roof supported by a forest of pillars or columns, right?
Precisely that. So instead of trying to span a massive space with one risky dome, they divided the space into a grid and covered each section with a smaller, much more manageable dome.
So they just broke it down into smaller, safer units.
Yeah. And you can see this perfectly executed in the Ulu Kami, or the Great Mosque in Bursa.
Okay, completed around 1399.
Yes, 1399. When you walk into the Ulu Kami, you do not see a single soaring vault. You step into a vast rectangular prayer hall that is covered by 20 equal-sized domes.
20 of them.
20, arranged in a 4x5 grid. And they are supported by 12 massive square interior piers.
Okay, so to get the square footage they needed for the congregation, they just multiplied the smaller structural units. But doesn't that defeat the purpose of an open space? I mean, you end up with a room filled with giant stone blocks that are basically blocking everyone's line of sight.
Well, yeah, it is a compromise.
Yeah.
You gain the horizontal square footage and you achieve a fireproof, permanent stone structure. But you do sacrifice the unbroken sightlines. The interior feels dense. It's almost forest-like.
Because the piers have to be thick.
Exactly. The piers are thick because they have to carry the weight of multiple domes straight down into the foundation. It's a highly pragmatic solution to a complex engineering problem. But, as the empire began to consolidate its territory and its social structures evolved, their architectural needs shifted away from just raw square footage.
Right.
We start to see the emergence of a very specific layout known as the T-plan, or the Zawiya structure.
Yeah, I noticed in the source material that many of these early structures weren't actually called mosques at first. They functioned as zawis. So what exactly is a zawi, and why did it dictate a T-shaped floor plan?
So a zawi was a multifunctional complex. It was designed primarily to serve Sufi brotherhoods, which were known as the ahiler.
Okay.
Because in the early days of Ottoman expansion, the state did not have a massive centralized bureaucracy to govern newly conquered towns. They just didn't have the manpower.
So they outsourced it.
Exactly. They relied heavily on these Sufi orders to mobilize the local population, integrate new converts, provide charity, organize civic life.
It was like a community center.
Very much so. So the architecture had to reflect that multi-purpose role. A zawi was not just for Friday prayers. It was a hostel for traveling merchants and dervishes. It had a kitchen, a teaching area, and a space for complex Sufi ritual.
Which involved a lot of chanting and movement.
Right, the whirling, the chanting.
So let's look at a specific one. The Yesel Mosque in Bursa, built between 1419 and 1424. That's a classic example of this T-plan. If you were walking into the Yesel Mosque, how does the building physically guide you through those different functions?
So when you enter, you first step into a central domed hall. This space is the junction. It often featured a central fountain, and it basically functioned as an indoor courtyard.
Okay.
From this central space, the building branches out. Flanking you on the left and right are smaller, raised rooms called iwans.
And what were those used for?
These were the spaces used for lodging travelers, holding meetings, or conducting administrative work. Then, directly ahead of you, elevated by a few steps, is the main prayer hall, which is also domed and contains the mihrab.
The niche indicating the direction of Mecca.
Right.
Hence the T-shape. The central hall and the side rooms form the top bar of the T, and the elevated prayer hall forms the vertical stem.
You got it.
It feels like an architecture of highly compartmentalized utility. You can have someone sleeping in the side room, someone discussing trade in the central hall, and someone praying in the main hall, and it's all under one roof.
That is the exact function. And the Yesel Mosque is also vital for another reason. It showcases how the Ottomans were actively synthesizing different cultural aesthetics.
Oh, right.
Because the architect, Akilvaz Mehmed, he actually had a background in military engineering.
Which makes sense for the time.
It does, and you can see that influence in the robust, incredibly thick brick and stone walls that make the building feel like a fortress.
Yeah.
But layered directly on top of that heavy Anatolian masonry is a delicate, vibrant aesthetic drawn entirely from Persian traditions.
The tile work. The details on the Yesel Mosque are staggering. They used Persian ceramic techniques, specifically these heavily glazed tiles in deep cobalt blue and bright turquoise. And these tiles cover the portals, the interior walls, the mihrab. It creates this jarring, almost hallucinatory contrast. You have these thick, defensive stone walls, and then they're coated in this gleaming, reflective, jewel-toned ceramic.
It's beautiful, and the production of those tiles was highly specialized. They utilized a technique called cuerda seca.
Cuerda seca.
Yeah, it means dry cord. Basically, different colored glazes are separated by a greasy line containing manganese, so the colors do not bleed together in the kiln.
Oh, so they can do really intricate designs.
Exactly. This allowed for incredibly intricate, multicolored floral and geometric patterns on a single tile. By marrying the heavy, pragmatic stone engineering of Anatolia with the refined, colorful ceramic arts of Persia, the early Ottomans were declaring a message.
That they weren't just warlords.
Right. They were declaring that they were not just military conquerors, they were patrons of high culture.
But this early phase of experimentation, with the T-plans and the multi-domed grids, eventually hits a hard limit. Because in 1453, the geopolitical reality of the world fundamentally changes. The Ottomans conquer Constantinople.
Right. Everything changed.
You take the capital of the Byzantine Empire, and suddenly a multi-domed utilitarian Xavier is no longer sufficient.
No, it's not.
They need an architecture of absolute, centralized imperial authority to prove they are the legitimate successors to Rome.
Yeah, the conquest of Constantinople demanded a total reinvention of the Ottoman spatial language. They possessed a world city now, and they needed to project power on a global scale.
So how did they do it?
Well, what is particularly revealing is how they divided that projection. They developed two completely distinct architectural philosophies, one for the spiritual realm and one for the administrative realm.
Okay, so let's start with the administrative realm. For that, they built the Topkapi Palace, and Topkapi Palace served as the nerve center of the Ottoman Empire for nearly 400 years. But the layout of this complex is entirely counterintuitive if you're used to looking at European royal architecture from the same era.
Oh, absolutely. If you look at the architectural logic of a European monarch, say a French king building Versailles, or a Russian czar building the Winter Palace, the philosophy is monolithic.
Right, it's a giant box.
Exactly. You build a single, massive, continuous block of masonry. You create an enormous facade designed to overwhelm the viewer the moment they arrive. It's a singular fist of power.
Yeah.
Topkapi rejects that logic entirely. Topkapi operates on modular design.
So it's not one building. It's a sprawling, decentralized web.
Yeah.
It covers this enormous area on a promontory overlooking the Bosphorus. And it consists of over 400 distinct rooms, independent pavilions, barracks, gardens, all spread across these terraced slopes.
Right.
But if there's no giant facade to intimidate you, how does Topkapi actually project power?
It projects power through the progressive restriction of space. Yeah, Topkapi is essentially a series of filters. It's organized into 4 main courtyards, aligned on an axis. And as you move from the first courtyard to the fourth, the space becomes increasingly restricted, silent, and exclusive.
Oh.
Power is not demonstrated by showing you the Sultan. It is demonstrated by proving how impossible it is for you to reach him.
That is fascinating. Okay, let's trace that path for a second. So you start by walking through the massive imperial gate, the Baba Humayun. You enter the first courtyard. This is known as the parade court. What's happening in this space?
So the first courtyard is loud, it's chaotic, and it's functional. It basically functioned as an outer precinct or an imperial park. Non-palace personnel, foreign merchants, supply wagons, and petitioners could freely enter this space.
So it's basically public.
Mostly, yeah. It was the staging ground for military processions. And interestingly, the Ottomans retained the Byzantine church of Hagia Irene right inside this courtyard.
Wait, they kept a church inside the palace walls?
They did. They didn't tear it down.
Wow.
They repurposed it as an armory to store weapons. So this courtyard was the logistical hub, but you could go no further without explicit authorization.
Okay, so to go further, you have to pass through the middle gate, the Babus Salam. And this gate looks like a medieval fortress. It has these 2 massive octagonal towers.
Right.
This is the first hard filter. Only authorized officials can pass through here. And everyone, except the Sultan himself, has to dismount their horse and proceed on foot.
A huge sign of respect.
Right. So once you walk through that gate, you enter the second courtyard, and the noise of the city fades away. This is the administrative engine room of the empire.
Yes. And the spatial organization of the second courtyard tells you exactly what the state valued. On your left side, taking up the entire length of the courtyard, are the palace kitchens.
Kitchens, taking up an entire side of the main administrative courtyard. That seems like an odd placement for a royal palace. Why put the cooking facilities front and center?
Because in the Ottoman political mindset, the ability to feed your people is the ultimate proof of sovereignty.
Oh, I see.
These kitchens were monumental structures. They were eventually redesigned by Mimar Sinan to include towering conical chimneys to draw out the smoke. They were industrial in scale, designed to prepare highly specialized meals for up to 4,000 people every single day.
4,000.
Daily. The logistics involved in provisioning this space, bringing in grain, meat, spices, and firewood, were a daily demonstration of the empire's vast wealth and organizational capacity. So the kitchens were a political statement.
That makes a lot of sense. So then on the opposite side of the courtyard, on the right, you have the political counterpart to the kitchens, which is the Imperial Council Hall, or the Divanane.
Yes.
This is a domed structure with wide eaves where the Grand Vizier and the state ministers actually governed the empire. But the most striking feature of this building isn't the hall itself, it's the structure attached to it.
Right, the Tower of Justice.
Yes, the Tower of Justice. It's this tall, square, multi-story tower with a conical roof. It is one of the few highly visible vertical markers in the entire palace complex. You can see it across the city. What was the function of this tower?
It functioned as a panopticon.
A panopticon, meaning the unseen watcher.
Exactly. Inside the Imperial Council Hall, where the viziers debated policy and rendered legal decisions, there was a small window covered by a dense golden lattice.
Okay.
That window connected directly to the Tower of Justice. The Sultan could enter the tower from his private quarters, sit behind that golden grille, and listen to the proceedings of his government without ever being seen.
The psychological weight of that design is incredible. I mean, the viziers never knew if the Sultan was sitting right behind the grate listening to every word they said, or if he was miles away in a garden somewhere.
That ambiguity is the core of the architecture. It enforced a constant state of discipline and, frankly, paranoia. The Sultan's power was absolute precisely because it was unseen. He was an omnipresent watcher.
Wow, I mean, that is just a brilliant use of space. And this theme of unseen power brings us to the most misunderstood area of the palace, which is the imperial harem.
Oh, definitely.
I really want to clarify the reality of this space. The Orientalist myth, perpetuated by centuries of European paintings and novels, paints the harem as this decadent, luxurious prison of leisure.
Right, draped in silk, eating grapes.
Exactly. But the architecture tells a completely different story. The harem was a highly structured, ruthless political institution.
It absolutely was. The physical layout of the harem is a dense, almost claustrophobic labyrinth. It comprises hundreds of small, interconnected rooms, dark corridors, and specialized courtyards built right into the slope of the hill.
Yeah.
Access and square footage within this complex were doled out based on a strict, unyielding hierarchy. The architecture physically manifested the social strata of the women and the eunuchs who lived there.
So you enter the harem, and the first spaces you encounter are the quarters of the black eunuchs, who acted as the guards and administrators of the precinct. Their courtyard is tight, tall, heavily fortified. And from there, you move into the main courtyards for the concubines and consorts. But the true center of gravity in this labyrinth belongs to the Valid Sultan.
The Queen Mother.
The Queen Mother.
Yeah, and the Valid Sultan wielded immense political influence. She often effectively ruled the empire during the reigns of young or incompetent sultans.
She was a powerhouse.
So her apartments are the largest, most ornate, and most centrally located within the harem. They consist of multiple domed rooms, private baths, a large courtyard.
And a proximity mattered.
Oh, everything was about proximity. The physical proximity of a woman's quarters to the Valid Sultan's apartments, or to the Sultan's private chambers, was an exact geographical map of her political power.
Wow.
If you lived in a tiny room on a lower floor, you had no influence. If you commanded a suite near the Valid, you held the ear of the state. The palace was not built for comfort. It was built for control.
Control, yeah. So the administration of the empire lived in this sprawling, modular, hidden labyrinth. But in the 16th century, when these same sultans decided to build spaces for God, the grand imperial mosques, they abandoned that modular logic entirely.
Completely discarded it.
In the spiritual realm, they craved absolute, visible, centralized unity. And this brings us to the classical zenith of Ottoman architecture, a period entirely defined by one man, Mimar Sinan.
Yes. Mimar Sinan is the undisputed genius of Ottoman engineering. He served as the chief imperial architect for nearly 50 years. He shaped the skyline of the empire under 3 different sultans, most notably Suleiman the Magnificent.
And to understand why his buildings look the way they do, you really have to understand his training. Because he was not raised in a traditional guild of stonemasons, drawing theoretical floor plans in a studio somewhere.
Right. His background is fascinating.
He was conscripted as a young man through the de jure system.
The draft.
Yeah, this is the practice where the Ottoman state drafted young boys from Christian provinces, converted them to Islam, and trained them for state service.
Exactly.
So Sinan became a janissary, an elite soldier. But his specific role was as a military engineer. He spent decades on grueling military campaigns across Europe and the Middle East. He built fortifications under artillery fire. He laid roads through mountains. He constructed aqueducts to supply armies.
It was incredibly practical experience. The defining anecdote of his early career occurred during a campaign in Wallachia, which is in present-day Romania.
Right.
The Ottoman army needed to cross the Prut River, which was surrounded by these treacherous swamps, and the situation was desperate. They were bogged down.
So what did you do?
Sinan stepped forward and engineered a massive wooden bridge over the mud and water in a matter of days, allowing the army to cross and continue the campaign.
I mean, he was working with raw timber, mud, deep water, and thousands of marching soldiers.
Yeah.
He had to figure out, purely through empirical observation, how to distribute dynamic loads so the bridge wouldn't snap under the weight of the cavalry.
Exactly. That hands-on, high-stakes background in logistics, in material strength, and load distribution, that is the key to his architectural philosophy, because he did not become the chief royal architect until he was nearly 50 years old.
Wow, so a whole lifetime of experience first.
By the time he started designing mosques, he understood structural physics on an intuitive level. When Sinan approached the design of a monumental religious space, he did not start by drawing a square on the ground and figuring out how to cap it. He conceptualized the building from the top down.
Right.
The starting point, the absolute center of the design, was the dome.
Because the dome is the representation of the celestial sphere. It represents the singular unity of God. So the architectural goal was to make that dome as massive as possible, push it as high as possible into the sky, and design the interior so it looked like the dome was floating without any visible support.
Right.
But going back to our earlier discussion, if you put a massive, incredibly heavy stone dome on a building, why doesn't the whole thing just collapse outward? What is physically stopping the walls from blowing out?
To solve that, Sinan perfected a structural system centered around the domed baldaquin.
Okay, break down the domed baldaquin for us.
Sure. So first, to put a round dome on a square room, he used pendentives. Picture a square room. The walls go straight up.
Okay, I'm picturing a square box.
To transition to a circle at the top, you insert pendentives into the upper corners of the room. A pendentive is a curved triangular segment of masonry. It curves inward as it rises, essentially rounding off the corners of the square and creating a continuous circular base at the top. So the weight of the dome rests on that circular base, and the pendentives channel that incredible weight down into the four corners of the room.
Okay, so the weight is channeled into the four corners. But you still have the problem of thrust, right? Gravity is pulling the dome down, but the curve of the dome is trying to push the walls outward, like a wedge, as you said earlier. How do you contain that lateral force?
This is where Sinan's mastery of the semidome comes into play.
The semidome.
Yes. Instead of building thick, solid walls to resist the thrust, which would make the interior dark and heavy, Sinan built half domes that lean against the base of the central dome.
Oh.
So when the central dome tries to push outward, it pushes into the semidomes. The semidomes catch that lateral force and step it down, transferring the energy outward and downward to a secondary set of arches, which then transfer it to massive exterior buttresses.
It's like a cascading waterfall of gravity. The weight flows from the peak of the central dome, spills into the semidomes, ripples outward into the arches, and is finally grounded safely into the earth outside the walls of the building.
That is a perfect way to describe it. And that cascading distribution of weight means the walls between the main piers do not have to carry the load of the roof.
Wait, so the walls aren't load-bearing?
Exactly. Because they are not load-bearing, Sinan could pierce those walls with hundreds of windows.
Oh, that's how they get so much light.
Yes. He eliminated the bulky interior columns that we saw in the Ulu Kami. He created a vast, unified, light-filled volume of space underneath the dome, achieving that celestial floating effect.
And we can track his obsession with refining this structural mechanism through 3 specific mosques, which he himself categorized as his apprentice, journeyman, and masterworks. Let's walk through them. His apprentice work is the Shehzadi Mosque in Istanbul, built in the 1540s.
Right. In the Shahzad Mosque, Sinan applied a perfectly symmetrical solution. He supported the central dome with 4 equal semi-domes on all 4 sides.
So one on each side of the square.
Exactly. The floor plan basically looks like a 4-leaf clover. It is structurally sound and visually harmonious, but the 4 massive piers holding up the corners still intrude slightly into the open space. It was a brilliant proof of concept, but he knew he could push the physics further.
So next came his journeyman work, the Süleymaniye Mosque, completed in 1557. This is the complex that dominates the skyline of Istanbul today. The scale is staggering.
It is. The main prayer hall of the Süleymaniye measures roughly 59 by 58 meters. The central dome has a diameter of 26.5 meters and rises 53 meters above the floor.
That is massive.
But here he changed his strategy. Instead of 4 semi-domes, he used only 2, placed along the longitudinal axis. This echoes the layout of the ancient Byzantine Hagia Sophia.
Right.
But unlike the Hagia Sophia, which has heavy galleries blocking the sides, Sinan opened up the side aisles completely. He incorporated the buttresses directly into the exterior walls, basically hiding them, which allowed him to flood the interior with light.
It is a masterpiece of spatial engineering. But he still wasn't satisfied. He considered the Süleymaniye Mosque in the city of Edirne, which was completed in 1574 when he was in his 80s, by the way, to be his absolute masterwork.
Yes, in his 80s.
What did he do differently at Edirne?
In the Süleymaniye, he completely discarded the square room and the 4-pier system.
Oh.
Instead of placing the dome on 4 points, he placed it on an octagonal baldachin. He used 8 massive, slender piers to support the central dome. By distributing the weight across 8 points instead of 4, the outward thrust at any single point was significantly reduced.
Making it much safer.
Yes, and this allowed him to make the dome even larger, and the walls even thinner and more pierced with windows.
And the dimensions of the Süleymaniye are just a testament to sheer mathematical confidence. The dome is exactly 31.25 meters in diameter, and its peak is elevated 43.25 meters from the floor. These proportions are not arbitrary. They achieve a visual harmony that closely approximates the golden ratio.
It's stunning.
The dome of the Süleymaniye actually matches, and by some internal measurements exceeds, the dome of the Hagia Sophia. But it doesn't look heavy. It integrates into the overall structure with a completely unified, almost crystalline geometry.
The visual geometry is stunning, but what is truly remarkable is the invisible geometry inside the stone.
Meaning what?
Well, remember the reality of the North Anatolian Fault from the start of our discussion. Turkey is a highly active seismic zone.
Right, earthquakes are a constant threat.
Exactly. A rigid building will shatter during an earthquake. A building must be able to flex and dissipate kinetic energy. Post-2020 digital reconstructions and LiDAR scans of Sinan's mosques have revealed the hidden mechanics of his seismic engineering.
What did the scans find inside the walls?
Researchers discovered an extensive network of concealed wrought iron tie rods and internal structural buttressing hidden deep within the cores of the masonry piers and arches.
Wait, iron tie rods inside the stone?
Yes. Furthermore, Sinan used lead joints between the heavy stone blocks instead of just rigid mortar.
Why lead?
Because when an earthquake sends shockwaves through the ground, the lead joints allow the stones to shift slightly without cracking, and the iron tie rods act as a tensile skeleton, absorbing the stretching forces and basically pulling the structure back into alignment.
He was engineering elasticity into millions of pounds of limestone. He built structures designed to ride out centuries of tectonic violence.
It's unparalleled engineering.
Now, while Sinan was busy engineering these celestial domes for the Sultan, how did this practical intelligence, specifically regarding environmental adaptation and seismic resilience, trickle down to everyday Ottoman life?
That's a great question.
I want to shift our focus to vernacular architecture, the ordinary homes and civic buildings where the vast majority of the population actually lived.
Yeah, the vernacular architecture shared the same core logic of form following function, but applied to local materials and daily routines.
Right.
The traditional Anatolian house, generally known as the Hayat house, is a perfect example of environmental adaptation.
If you look at a classic Ottoman house, the profile is very distinct. It almost looks top-heavy.
It does, yeah.
You have a solid, blocky base, and then an upper floor that seems to lean out, protruding over the street. Why design a house that way?
The design is highly functional. Typically, the ground floor was built of thick, unyielding stone or brick with very few windows. This provided security from the street, thermal insulation, and a stable foundation.
Okay, makes sense.
The upper stories, however, were built using a much lighter timber frame filled with adobe or brick. These upper stories often projected outward over the street below, creating a cantilevered overhang known as a sukma.
A cantilever meaning a structure anchored at only one end, extending outward into space.
Correct. And the sukma served several crucial purposes. First, it maximized the living square footage on the upper floors without taking up valuable street-level footprint.
Clever.
Second, by pushing the rooms out over the street, you could install windows on 3 sides of the projecting room, maximizing cross-ventilation to catch the summer breeze.
Built-in air conditioning.
Exactly. And third, the overhang cast a deep shadow onto the street below, creating a cooling microclimate for pedestrians in the harsh summer sun.
Brilliant. And internally, the layout of the house centered around a main hall called a sofa or hayat, which acted as the central circulation hub. It was basically the lungs of the house.
Right.
And in wealthier homes, the architecture mirrored the strict social hierarchies we saw in Topkapi Palace, just on a smaller scale.
Yeah.
You had a rigid division of space.
Yes.
The salamlik was the male and public section of the house where business was conducted and guests were received. The haremlik was the private, family section, entirely restricted from outside view.
And just as we saw with the mosques, the local geography strictly dictated the building forms. The empire covered vastly different climates.
Yeah, spanning multiple continents.
Right. So in the hot, arid regions of the south and east, houses were built with flat roofs. These roofs functioned as outdoor living rooms. Families would sleep on the roof to escape the heat trapped indoors, or they'd use the space to dry fruits and vegetables.
And in the north?
In the rainy, humid regions of the north and west, like along the Black Sea, flat roofs would cave in from water damage, so heavily sloped tile roofs were mandatory.
But the most fascinating vernacular adaptation relates back to our earthquake discussion. In northern Anatolia, in cities like Amasya, the local builders developed a technique to keep their houses from collapsing during tremors.
Oh, this is one of my favorite details. They utilized a system called timber lacing, locally known as hatol.
Okay, how does that work?
Well, within the heavy stone or brick masonry walls, builders embedded continuous horizontal wooden beams at regular vertical intervals, almost like drawing stripes on the wall.
Just putting wood right inside the stone wall.
Yes, because stone has immense compressive strength. It can hold a lot of weight, but terrible tensile strength. If you bend stone, it snaps.
Right.
Wood has excellent tensile strength. It can flex and bend without breaking.
So when an earthquake hits and the ground shifts sideways, the rigid stone wants to shatter. But the flexible wooden bands act like shock absorbers. They take on the tensile stress, hold the masonry together, and prevent the rigid wall from blowing apart.
It is the exact same principle as Sinan's hidden iron tie rods, just executed with local timber.
That is just brilliant local engineering. Another crucial civic structure that reflects the empire's architectural logic is the hammam, or public bathhouse.
Oh, absolutely.
The hammam was an absolute necessity for public hygiene and religious ablution, but it was also a major social center. Architecturally, the hammam is a localized, functional application of imperial dome architecture. Let's walk the listener through the sequence of a classical Ottoman hammam.
Okay.
Because it's a highly choreographed spatial experience designed to manage a severe temperature gradient and facilitate social interaction. You walk in from the street, and you first enter a room called the Soyun Malik.
Yes. The Soyun Malik is the changing room. It is usually the largest, most imposing space in the complex. It's a large, square room covered by a high, unheated dome, and it often features a decorative stone fountain in the center.
So it's cool in there.
The air here is cool, yeah. It served as a social gathering place, a place to drink coffee and converse before and after the bathing ritual.
Okay, so from the changing room, you transition into the sogukluk, which translates to the cold room, though in practice, from what I understand, it's more of a tepid, transitional preparation zone.
Right. It's not actually cold. The temperature here is warm, allowing your body to gradually adjust to the rising heat before you face the extreme environment of the final room.
And the final room is the hot room, or the suklik. This is the architectural climax of the building.
It is. In major imperial hammams, such as the Chamberlain Hammam in Istanbul, which was designed by Sinan, the hot room is often a decagonal space, meaning a 10-sided polygon.
Okay, 10 sides.
And it is entirely covered in marble to retain heat. The space is covered by a dome that is deliberately punctured with dozens of small, star-shaped glass oculi.
Oculi, like little eye windows.
Yes, these tiny windows let in tight, dramatic shafts of sunlight that cut through the dense steam.
It sounds incredibly cinematic. And underneath that dome, in the very center of the room, is a large, heated, raised marble platform called the Dolmabahçe.
Yes, the belly stone.
Right. And the heat is generated by an underground furnace, and the hot smoke and air circulate through a hypocaust system.
Which is a network of flues built directly into the walls and under the floor, radiating intense heat into the room. Bathers lie flat on the heated marble to sweat and receive massages.
The entire sequence is a masterclass in thermodynamics, acoustics, and domed architecture, creating a highly specific, immersive sensory environment.
It really is. And, for centuries, this architectural language, whether we are talking about a grand classical mosque designed by Sinan, a timber-laced house in Amasya, or a domed public hammam, was completely self-contained.
They knew it worked for them.
Exactly. The Ottoman Empire had its own distinct, unified, and supremely confident aesthetic vocabulary. They did not need to look outward.
But as the geopolitical landscape of Europe and the Middle East shifted violently in the 18th century, so did the architecture.
Yes, it did.
Which brings us to the era of cosmopolitan globalism, specifically the Tulip period and the emergence of the Ottoman Baroque. The 18th century marks a period of profound psychological transition for the empire.
Very much so.
Following massive territorial losses and treaties like the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, the Ottoman Empire's long era of relentless military expansion finally ground to a halt. The state recognized that it could no longer rely solely on military force.
They had to adapt.
They had to pivot to diplomacy. They began sending permanent ambassadors to European capitals like Paris, Vienna, and London. And this exposure initiated a wave of cultural exchange that fundamentally altered Ottoman visual culture.
I actually want to address a critical point regarding how this transition is often framed.
Oh, please do.
In older historical texts, there is a pervasive academic bias that views this period as a decline.
Yeah, I saw that in the sources.
The narrative assumes that because Ottoman military dominance waned, their later art and architecture were somehow degenerate, that they were simply passively imitating European styles out of weakness.
Like they were just copying them.
Exactly. But examining the actual structures reveals a very different reality. The adoption of Western styles was not passive decline. It was a highly deliberate, conscious choice by the Ottoman elite.
So they were doing it on purpose?
Oh, entirely on purpose.
Wow.
They were actively adapting their visual language to participate in a global diplomatic aesthetic. They wanted to signal to European ambassadors that the Ottoman Empire was a modern, cosmopolitan participant in global culture, not some isolated medieval relic.
It's an architecture of diplomacy.
Very well put.
And this shift begins in earnest during a brief but highly influential era known as the Tulip period, running roughly from 1718 to 1730.
Right. And the Tulip period gets its name from the court's intense, almost manic fascination with cultivating rare tulips, which became a symbol of wealth and refinement. Architecturally, the period represents a shift away from the monumental, austere mosques of the classical era.
Toward what?
Toward domestic architecture focused on leisure, nature, and ornamental excess.
A prime example from this era is the Dolmabahçe Palace, built along the sweet waters of Europe in Istanbul. It looks absolutely nothing like Topkapi.
Nothing at all.
It featured light, airy pavilions, curved facades, elaborate outdoor water features, and integrated Western decorative whimsy. The architecture became lighter, more focused on the enjoyment of the gardens and courtly pageantry, rather than projecting military might.
And this growing appetite for European aesthetics paved the way for a much deeper synthesis in the 1740s, the full emergence of the Ottoman Baroque.
Now, when we talk about Baroque architecture in Europe, like the churches in Rome or the palaces in Austria, we think of theatricality.
Drama, yeah.
We think of dramatic, sweeping curves, deep shadows, complex geometry, and intense, overwhelming ornamentation. How did Ottoman architects translate that highly specific, highly Catholic European vocabulary into their own Islamic religious architecture?
You can see the translation perfectly executed in the Nur Osmani Mosque in Istanbul, which was constructed between 1748 and 1755. It represents a radical, shocking departure from Sinan's classical style.
I mean, the moment you look at the floor plan of the Nur Osmani, you realize the rules have changed. The courtyard of a classical Ottoman mosque is always a perfect rectangle. The courtyard of the Nur Osmani is horseshoe-shaped.
Right.
It is a semicircle. That is an entirely new geometry for an Ottoman mosque.
Exactly. The architects completely abandoned the strict straight lines of the classical period. The arches in the Nur Osmania are undulating.
They ways.
They do. The building utilizes mixed linear forms, architectural shapes that are constructed of both straight lines and complex curves. And the stone carvers seamlessly adopted French Rococo motifs.
Like what kind of motifs?
You see massive stone facades carved with detailed acanthus leaves, shell patterns, and floral cascades. The interior utilizes illusionistic structural techniques, pushing the windows deeper into the walls to create a sense of theatrical depth and shadow.
But the crucial point here is that they did not abandon their Islamic identity. They didn't just build a French church and call it a mosque. The traditional Ottoman calligraphic panels remained highly prominent, but instead of being placed on flat classical walls, the calligraphy was integrated directly into the heavily ornamented, undulating Baroque stonework.
It is a unique, confident hybrid style. The empire is using the visual vocabulary of the European Baroque, but they are speaking Ottoman Turkish with it.
That's a great way to look at it. And this willingness to experiment with international aesthetics set a powerful precedent.
It really did.
Once the strict, centuries-old rules of the classical period were relaxed, Ottoman architects became increasingly bold. This appetite for stylistic blending paved the way for the 19th century, an era where architects would mix multiple disparate historical styles into single, colossal imperial structures.
Which brings us to the 19th century, an era completely defined by a desperate need for modernization, the Tanzimat reforms, the dominance of the Balian family of architects, and a massive effort of imperial reinvention.
Okay, let's unpack that. The Tanzimat reforms.
Right, the Tanzimat reforms, which officially began in 1839, were a comprehensive, empire-wide effort to modernize the Ottoman state, its legal codes, its tax systems, and its military along strictly Western lines.
They were trying to catch up.
The empire was trying to centralize power and prove its administrative parity with European empires. Architecture was aggressively utilized as the visible public face of this modernization.
So who was building these new faces?
The imperial court heavily favored architects who could deliver grand European styles, most notably the Balian family.
The Balians.
Yes, the Balians were a dynasty of Ottoman Armenian architects who effectively served as the chief imperial builders for generations. They completely reshaped the shoreline of the Bosphorus.
And we see a rapid progression of styles as the century unfolds. In the early 19th century, under Sultan Mahmud II, the empire style takes root.
Right.
This was a form of severe neoclassicism popularized in Europe by Napoleon. A fascinating, highly specific example of this is the Hurka-i-Sharif Mosque, built between 1847 and 1851.
The Hurka-i-Sharif is a unique structure with a very specific function. It was built explicitly to house the Holy Mantle, a sacred relic belonging to the Prophet Muhammad.
Oh, wow. I mean, that is a huge deal.
It is, and because of this unique, highly elevated function, the architects applied a pure, rigid neoclassical style to give it a sense of ancient permanence.
It is striking to look at. The mosque features minarets that do not look like traditional slender Ottoman pencils. They're heavily styled to mimic Corinthian columns, complete with ornate capitals. Applying classical Greek and Roman architectural vocabulary to an Islamic religious structure is a stark visual statement. But the ultimate, most overwhelming expression of this 19th century reinvention is the Dolmabahçe Palace, completed in 1856.
Dolmabahçe Palace represents a total, absolute rejection of the Topkapi Palace model.
Completely.
Topkapi, as we discussed, was sprawling, decentralized, hidden, and deeply private.
Lots of courtyards, very quiet.
Right. Dolmabahçe is a massive, highly symmetrical, single-block, European-style palace built right on the water's edge of the Bosphorus. It is designed to be seen immediately by any ship entering the strait, presenting an overwhelming continuous facade of power and wealth.
The scale is hard to comprehend. It spans over 110,000 square meters of floor space, containing 285 rooms and 46 halls.
It's massive.
And the exterior looks like it was plucked directly from Vienna or Paris. It features monumental, highly sculptural gates, heavy colonnades, aggressive neoclassical symmetry. But I want to explore how the building actually functioned. Because it looks European on the outside, but how did the Sultan navigate the inside?
This is where the true eclecticism lies. The eclecticism is not just in the decoration, it is in the spatial function.
What do you mean?
Internally, the palace rigidly retains the traditional Ottoman spatial division.
Really?
Yes, despite the European envelope, the floor plan is strictly divided into two halves. You have the Salamuk, the highly ornate public section for official state business, receiving foreign dignitaries and male administration. And completely sealed off from that is the harem, the private family life of the Sultan.
So a European ambassador would pull up to this neoclassical facade, walk through a Baroque entrance, conduct business in a Rococo stateroom, and assume he was in a fully westernized court. But he would only be seeing half the building. The Sultan could walk through a door and be in a traditional, highly restricted Ottoman domestic space.
Precisely. The two distinct sections of the palace are separated by a massive central domed ceremonial hall known as the Moye Salonu, which, by the way, features a 4.5-ton crystal chandelier sent from Britain. Naturally. They adopted the Western architectural skin to project modernity to the outside world, but they kept the Ottoman social core to maintain their internal cultural structure.
This raises a massive question regarding the public perception of these buildings.
Yeah.
You had these grand imperial mosques being built during the same era, like the Dolmabahçe Mosque right next to the palace, or the famous Ortaköy Mosque perched on the water.
Beautiful buildings.
But they have massive windows, ornate chandeliers, and heavily carved stone facades that look more like European opera houses or Baroque palaces than the classic, austere, grounded silhouettes of Sinan's mosques. How did the general public or the traditional religious clerics react to this radical, flashy shift in sacred architecture?
The reaction was complex, but it is essential to understand that these highly eclectic, Europeanized mosques were primarily imperial commissions.
Okay.
They were statements dictated by the Sultan. They were not built from the ground up by local communities. They were imposed from the top down.
Ah, so it was state policy.
Very much so. The highly ornate gates, the massive windows flooding the interior with light, the aggressive mixture of Baroque, Rococo, and Neoclassical elements, these were deliberate choices of statecraft. The Sultan was communicating to both his subjects and to foreign dignitaries that the Ottoman Empire was a modern, wealthy European power as much as it was an Islamic one.
Interesting.
While traditionalists and religious conservatives may have privately preferred the classical austerity of the 16th century, the imperial court possessed the authority to dictate the aesthetic of the capital. The architecture was an instrument to force modernization into the public eye.
But as the 19th century drew to a close and the empire faced increasing political and financial instability, the architectural pendulum swung one final time. Under Sultan Abdulhamid II in the late 19th century, the imperial residence was moved away from the highly visible Dolmabahçe Palace to a new complex further up the hills, the Yıldız Palace.
Yes.
And ironically, after decades of building massive, single-block European palaces, Yıldız reverts back to a scattered, village-like layout in a highly fortified wooded park. It is conceptually much closer in spirit to the hidden nature of Topkapi, though vastly different in style.
The Yıldız complex is the ultimate showcase of late-century architectural eclecticism and fragmentation. Because it was built pavilion by pavilion over decades, there is no single unifying style.
It's just a mix.
It's a total mix. You have highly diverse structures sitting mere meters from each other. There is the chalet pavilion, designed specifically to look like a massive Swiss mountain chalet, which was built to host the German Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm II.
Swiss chalet in Istanbul.
Right. And just a short walk away, you have structures designed by the Italian architect Raimondo Duranco in the cutting-edge Art Nouveau style, featuring organic, sweeping lines and intricate floral ironwork. The supreme architectural unity of the classical period was completely replaced by a catalog of disjointed global styles.
Reflecting an empire desperately trying to find a secure footing in a rapidly changing modern world.
Precisely.
Let's pull all of this together. We have traced an incredible trajectory today. We started in the 14th century with the pragmatic, heavy, multi-domed stone spaces of Bursa, where architects adapted the tensile concept of the nomadic tent to permanent masonry to survive fire and war.
Right.
We climbed to the breathtaking engineering heights in the 16th century where Mimar Sinan empirically mastered load distribution, utilizing pendatives and cascading semi-domes to create celestial unified spaces like the Süleymaniye and Selimi mosques, while secretly embedding them with iron tie rods to survive earthquakes.
Such an engineering marvel.
And finally, we navigated the geopolitical anxieties of the 18th and 19th centuries, where the empire deliberately adopted Baroque, Neoclassical, and eclectic styles building grand, globally influenced palaces along the Bosphorus to project a modernized identity to an encroaching Europe.
It is a remarkable trajectory that perfectly mirrors the lifespan of the empire itself. And if we connect this evolution to a broader understanding of how human beings build, it leaves us with a final thought to consider.
Which is?
We so often view buildings merely as static objects, as just a collection of bricks, mortar, and timber. But the evolution of Ottoman architecture demonstrates that buildings are actually living, breathing arguments.
Yeah.
As the empire finally transitioned into the early 20th century and faced its collapse, a completely new architectural trend emerged in Istanbul, the first national architectural movement.
A return to their roots.
Yes, exactly. This movement began to intentionally strip away the European Baroque and Neoclassical influences that had dominated for 2 centuries. Architects began reaching backward, reviving classic Ottoman and Seljuk motifs like pointed arches, deep overhangs, and intricate geometric tilework. They used modern building materials like concrete, but clad them in historical aesthetics.
Fascinating.
The architecture was arguing for a return to a specific indigenous identity amidst a rapidly westernizing world.
It fundamentally changes how you look at the buildings around you, because architecture is always making an argument. How do modern cities today use architecture to argue for their own identity? When a rapidly developing city builds a massive, generic glass skyscraper, are they looking outward for global validation, trying to fit into an international aesthetic? Just like the Ottomans building a Baroque palace to impress French ambassadors. Or, when a city incorporates historical vernacular motifs into new construction, are they reaching backward into their own history to anchor themselves, to claim a specific identity in an increasingly homogenized world? It turns out that building on the corner isn't just a structure to keep the rain out. It is a physical fossil of our psychology. Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.